What would you do if the very thing you cherished most in the world started slipping away and no amount of money could save it? A millionaire discovers that his wife has cancer and uses all his money to treat his wife. But the money was not enough. He never left her side. He always remained strong. But with the help of God, his wife was cured. Even after losing all his fortune, he is happy with the love of his life, and God is closer. David had built an empire. He wasn't just wealthy. He had amassed a fortune that most could only dream of. Every morning, he and his wife, Sarah, woke up in their grand estate, a sprawling mansion with more rooms than they could count, where luxury cars lined the driveway, and their wealth was evident in every corner. But to David, his most prized possession wasn't his fleet of cars or the stockpile of assets. It was Sarah. In their grand house, their life was not just a reflection of wealth and power, but of love. Every shared glance, every small gesture between them spoke of a bond that went beyond the material world. They were partners in every sense. Despite the money, despite the market-driven world they lived in, David always said that Sarah was his greatest fortune, and she echoed that sentiment. Together, they built their life, not just with the money that flowed through the market, but with the quiet moments they spent together in their favorite room. Looking out over the city they ruled. Though David had the mind of a businessman, always calculating, always thinking ahead, when it came to Sarah, his heart took the lead. They didn't just live in a house. They had made it a home, filled with memories that money couldn't buy. In their most private moments, wealth faded into the background. They'd sit in the living room, share stories of their youth, laugh about how they met, and pray together. Faith was an important thread woven into their relationship. Although they didn't talk about it often, both David and Sarah knew that their connection to God was the invisible anchor holding everything in place. This quiet faith, ever present yet never forced, shaped their worldview, reminding them that even amidst their wealth, there was something bigger at play. David's life wasn't without its pressures. The market, the wealth, the constant demands of running a business empire, it could weigh heavily on anyone's shoulders. But every evening when he came home, the sight of Sarah waiting for him in their house made it all worthwhile. She grounded him. She was his peace amidst the chaos. They spent weekends away from the glitz and glamour of their social circle, often retreating to a quiet apartment they owned in the city, where they could escape the demands of their wealth. It was in these simple, quiet moments, when the cars and the market seemed a world away, that they found their true happiness. They had wealth, sure, but more importantly, they had each other. For Sarah, life with David wasn't about the money, the luxurious house, or the fancy cars. She knew how much they had in terms of wealth, but it never defined her. What mattered most to her was the life they built together, the nights they prayed, the mornings they spent sipping coffee in their garden, and the unwavering support they showed each other through thick and thin. She often told David, "Money comes and goes, but love, that's what truly makes us rich." He'd smile, kiss her on the forehead, and agree wholeheartedly. To the outside world, they were the picture of wealth, living the dream in their grand house with the market bending to their will. But inside, they were just David and Sarah, two people who had found something far more valuable than money. But as in every great story, this peaceful chapter of their lives wouldn't last forever. Life, as David and Sarah knew, was full of surprises. Some that couldn't be predicted. No matter how much wealth one had, no matter how many assets or cars one owned, beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect world, something was about to shift. And it wouldn't be the market or the business. It would be something far more personal, far more devastating. They had weathered storms in the past, business challenges, market fluctuations, personal losses, but nothing could have prepared them for what was coming. This next chapter would test everything they believed about love, wealth, and, most importantly, their faith. One evening, after a routine day of meetings and business calls, David came home to find Sarah looking a little more tired than usual. At first, he brushed it off. Everyone had exhausting days. But as the weeks went by, Sarah's fatigue turned into something more concerning. She'd always been energetic, running around their house, keeping things in order, enjoying life. But now, even the simplest of tasks seemed to drain her. It wasn't long before they decided that a visit to the doctor was necessary, more to put their minds at ease than anything else. They were sure it would be something minor, something fixable. After all, They had access to the best healthcare money could buy. David held Sarah's hand tightly as they sat in the doctor's office, the sterile environment a stark contrast to the warmth of their home. The doctor's words hit them like a freight train. Cancer. In that moment, everything they had, the wealth, the house, the cars, meant nothing. All David could think about was Sarah, his wife, his love, his partner, and everything. She was more than his wealth. She was his world. As he sat there, mind racing, heart pounding, he couldn't help but wonder how they would navigate this. This was no market crisis or business deal. This was their life, their love, and Sarah's very existence hanging in the balance. The diagnosis changed everything. Sarah's illness hung over them like a dark cloud, and David, the man who had always been able to fix things with his mind and money, suddenly found himself powerless in ways he'd never imagined. The doctors laid out the treatment plan, and David knew what had to be done. Whatever it took, he would do it. If he had to pour every last dollar into her recovery, he would. After all, what was wealth if it couldn't save the person you loved most? In his mind, there was no limit to what he would spend. He'd sell their cars, their house, even his most profitable business ventures, if it meant Sarah would be all right. For David, it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about hope, and he clung to that hope with everything he had. David began liquidating assets almost immediately. The apartment in the city? Gone. The vacation house they'd spent so many happy summers in? Sold. Each sale was a step closer to saving Sarah, or so he believed. He worked tirelessly, negotiating deals, selling off properties, doing everything in his power to raise the funds needed for her treatment. And every time he saw her smile, even in the midst of her suffering, it fueled his determination. There were moments when Sarah would look at him, her eyes full of love, and say, "David, you don't have to do all this." But he would shake his head, taking her hand, and reply, "I'd give the world for you." And in truth, he was giving his world, his wealth, his money, everything he had built, just to see her well again. But no amount of money could prepare him for the emotional toll. David was used to being in control. The market, the business world, he could navigate those with ease. But this was different. Watching Sarah's health deteriorate despite all the treatments and specialists was something he couldn't control. The hospital visits became more frequent, the doctors timed, updates more grim, and with each passing day, the weight of the situation grew heavier. His mind, always calculating, always thinking ahead, was now consumed with thoughts of, what if? What if the money wasn't enough? What if she didn't make it? What if, despite everything, he lost the love of his life? In those quiet moments, when it was just the two of them, Sarah's calmness was what kept him grounded. She was the one enduring the physical pain, yet it was her strength that seemed to carry both of them. David marveled at how she could still find joy in the little things, how she'd laugh at an old memory or talk about future plans as if there was no cancer threatening to take it all away. Her faith, unwavering as ever, became their anchor. Even when the treatment seemed to be failing, even when the market of hope seemed to be crashing around them, Sarah never let go of her belief that they would make it through. "God's got us," she'd say, her voice soft but sure. And David, despite his fears, would nod, clinging to her words as tightly as he clung to her hand. But the financial strain was real. David's wealth, once seemingly endless, was dwindling fast. Every doctor's appointment, every round of treatment, every specialist, it all came with a price. And no matter how much he sold, no matter how many business deals he closed to cover the costs, it never felt like enough. The market of their financial world was crashing, and David was watching it happen in slow motion. But what could he do? He couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. Not while Sarah was still fighting. "We've been through tough times before," he'd tell her, trying to sound confident. "We'll get through this too." And every time she'd smile, the same hopeful smile that had always given him strength. The suffering wasn't just physical or financial, it was emotional. David, a man who had always prided himself on his ability to fix problems, found himself in unfamiliar territory. No matter how much money he threw at the problem, no matter how many specialists he hired, he couldn't fix this. And that realization, more than anything, was what broke him. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. Yet here he was, standing on the sidelines, watching the love of his life endure pain he couldn't take away. The wealth that had once made him feel invincible was now just a number in the background, meaningless in the face of Sarah's suffering. And yet, he couldn't stop trying, couldn't stop hoping that the next treatment, the next doctor, the next round of tests would bring the miracle they so desperately needed. As the weeks turned into months, their world became smaller. The mansion that had once been filled with laughter and plans for the future now felt empty, a hollow shell of the life they had built. The cars sat unused in the driveway. reminders of a world they no longer belonged to. Friends came and went, offering condolences, bringing flowers, but no one could really understand what they were going through. No one but them. It was in the quiet moments, late at night, when David would sit by Sarah's side, holding her hand as she slept, that he'd allow himself to feel the full weight of it all. The fear, the helplessness, the overwhelming love he had for her. In those moments, he prayed more than he ever had in his life. He wasn't a man of many words when it came to God. But now, in the silence of their house, all he could do was pray. Through it all, Sarah remained the light in his darkness. Even as her body weakened, her spirit never did. She continued to believe, continued to have faith that they would make it through. And that faith, that unshakable belief in something greater than themselves, was what kept David going. It wasn't the wealth, the money, or the market. It was Sarah's faith. "We're gonna be okay," she'd say, her voice barely a whisper but full of conviction. And David, no matter how scared he was, believed her. Because he had to. Because without that hope, without that faith, there was nothing left. The moment came when David realized that no amount of money could turn the tide. He had done everything in his power, sold the house, the apartment, the cars, yet it wasn't enough. The treatments weren't working as expected, and Sarah's condition continued to decline. They were sitting in the doctor's office, a place that had become far too familiar, when the final blow landed. "There's nothing more we can do," the doctor said, his voice soft but firm. David felt the words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. He looked over at Sarah, expecting her to break down, but she didn't. Instead, she reached over and took his hand, her eyes calm, full of the same unwavering faith that had carried them this far. "David," she whispered, "it's time to let go." He shook his head, unable to accept what she was saying. How could he let go? He had built his entire life around solving problems, making comebacks when everything seemed lost. But this wasn't a business deal or a market crash. This was Sarah, the love of his life, the one person he couldn't afford to lose. "I can't," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't lose you, Sarah. I can't." She squeezed his hand, her strength shining through even in her weakest moment. "You're not losing me. We're not losing each other. God's got us, David. We just have to trust him now." Those words broke something inside of David. He had spent his entire life trusting in his wealth, in his ability to navigate the complexities of the market, to control outcomes. But now, sitting there holding Sarah's hand as the weight of their situation crashed over him, he realized that none of that mattered anymore. He couldn't buy his way out of this. He couldn't fix this with money. The wealth he had spent his life accumulating meant nothing in the face of this. All that was left was love and faith. David closed his eyes, the tears finally spilling over, and for the first time, he let go. He prayed, really prayed, not for more time, not for another miracle treatment, but for peace, for strength, for the ability to trust in something bigger than himself. That night, as they lay in bed, Sarah resting her head on his chest, David felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't the kind of calm that came from a business victory or a financial windfall. This was different. This was the kind of peace that came from surrender. He had done everything he could, and now, for the first time in his life, he understood that it was out of his hands. "I love you," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet of their home. David kissed the top of her head, his heart full to bursting. "I love you too," he replied, his voice breaking. In that moment, he wasn't a millionaire, he wasn't a businessman, he was just a man, lying next to the love of his life, holding on to every second they had left together. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. There were moments of deep pain, of unimaginable sorrow, but there were also moments of profound love and connection. Sarah's health continued to decline, but her spirit never did. She remained the same beacon of hope and faith that she had always been, even as her body grew weaker. David, once so focused on saving her, now focused on simply being with her. They spent hours talking, reminiscing about the life they had built, the wealth that had once seemed so important, but now felt so insignificant. They prayed together, their faith growing stronger with each passing day. It was as if, in letting go of control, David had finally found the peace he had been searching for all along. But the pain was still there, lurking beneath the surface. There were moments when David would step out of the room, unable to bear the sight of Sarah in pain, and he would break down. He would punch the walls, scream into the silence of their now empty home, rage against the unfairness of it all. How could God let this happen? How could he lose everything, his wealth, his mind, and now the love of his life? But every time he returned to Sarah's side, she was there, her eyes full of that same unwavering faith. "We're going to be okay," she'd say, even as the pain racked her body. And David, no matter how broken he felt, would nod, because in that moment, he believed her. He had to. The climax of their journey wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic turnaround. It was quiet. It was simple. It was a moment of surrender, of faith, of love that transcended the material world they had once lived in. David held Sarah's hand as they sat in their living room, the last of their wealth gone, the future uncertain. But for the first time, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the love they shared, the life they had built together, and the faith that had carried them through it all. In that moment, they weren't a millionaire and his wife. They were just two people, holding on to each other, trusting in something bigger than themselves. "I love you," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too," Sarah replied, her voice barely a whisper. And in that moment, as they sat there, holding on to each other, David finally understood what true wealth really was. It wasn't money. It wasn't the market. It wasn't the house or the cars. It was love. It was faith. It was the quiet moments spent with the people you love, the moments that money could never buy. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to happen. Sarah, once so frail, began to show signs of improvement. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't something the doctors could explain. But day by day, her strength started to return. At first, it was just small things. Her smile coming back more often, the light in her eyes shining a little brighter. Then, as the days passed, she began to regain her energy, her body slowly recovering from the relentless toll of the illness. David watched in awe, unable to believe what was happening. This was the miracle they hadn't dared to hope for, the one that had seemed impossible when they had exhausted every treatment and spent the last of their wealth. The doctors were cautious, reminding David and Sarah that cancer didn't just disappear. But to them, it didn't matter what the medical report said. They could feel it in their bones, in their hearts. Sarah was getting better. She was healing. And it wasn't because of the money or the treatments. No, this was something far greater than that. This was God's hand at work, a miracle that went beyond anything wealth could achieve. David, who had always been a man of logic, who had lived his life trusting in the mind and market, now found himself believing in something much deeper. Faith. It had carried them through the darkest times, and now it was delivering them into the light. For the first time in months, David allowed himself to breathe. It was as if a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders, and he could finally see clearly. All the money they had lost, all the sacrifices they had made, it didn't matter. None of it mattered in the face of what they had gained. Sarah's health was returning, slowly but surely, and that was worth more than any amount of wealth or luxury. They didn't need the cars, the house, or the apartment. What they had now was far more valuable. A second chance, a deeper connection with each other, and a faith that had carried them through the storm. As Sarah's strength grew, so did their bond. David had always loved her, but now his love was different. It was deeper, more profound. He had watched her fight, had seen her suffer, and had stood by her side through every painful moment. And in doing so, he had come to realize that true wealth wasn't found in the market or in the material things they had once surrounded themselves with. True wealth was found in moments like this, in Sarah's laughter as she regained her strength, in the simple joy of holding her hand as they sat together in their now modest home. It was the love they shared, the faith they had held on to, that made them rich beyond measure. The market of their old life had collapsed, but in its place, something far more beautiful had emerged. Their relationship, once built on the foundation of comfort and success, now stood on the unshakable ground of love, faith, and hope. David had lost everything, his wealth, his cars, his house, but in the process, he had found what truly mattered. As Sarah's health continued to improve, they began to rebuild their life together. Not with money or material possessions, but with gratitude for the miracle they had been given, and the love that had carried them through it all. The days of luxury were gone, but David didn't miss them. He didn't miss the high-powered meetings, the market dealings, or the pressure of maintaining their wealth. All that had been stripped away, and in its absence, he had found something far more valuable. Sarah was alive, she was recovering, and they had been given the gift of more time together. That, to David, was the greatest wealth anyone could ever ask for. They didn't need a big house or expensive cars to feel rich. They had each other, and that was more than enough. Sarah's recovery wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Every day she thanked God for the miracle of her healing, for the strength that had carried them through the darkest of times. And every day, David joined her, kneeling beside her, praying with a heart full of gratitude. The faith that had once been a quiet, background presence in their lives was now the center of everything. It had sustained them when the money had run out, when the doctors had no answers, when all seemed lost. And now, it was what guided them forward, helping them rebuild their life on a foundation of love, faith, and hope. Their life was different now. Simpler, quieter, but infinitely richer. They no longer lived in a mansion. They had moved into a small, modest home. The cars were gone, replaced by a single car they shared. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that they had made it through the storm, that they had held on to each other and their faith, and that they had emerged stronger, more connected, and more grateful than ever before. David, once obsessed with the market, with wealth and success, now found joy in the simplest things. Sarah's smile, her laughter, the quiet moments they shared. The falling action of their story was not one of dramatic triumph, but of quiet, steady healing. It was a story of love that had weathered the worst of storms, of faith that had been tested and proven strong, of hope that had carried them through when all seemed lost. David had spent his life chasing wealth, building an empire, but in the end, it was love, faith, and hope that had saved him and Sarah. And that, more than anything else, was the true wealth they had found. Months had passed since the darkest days of their journey, and David found himself standing in front of the small house they now called home. It was modest compared to the mansion they had once lived in, but to David, it was perfect. The wealth, the cars, the sprawling house, they had all been symbols of a life he no longer yearned for. What mattered most was inside that home. Sarah, healthy and full of life once again, laughing as she tended to the garden. The richness of their life now had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with what the market could offer. It was about love, faith, and the miracle they had witnessed together. The loss of material wealth had been painful, but it had also been a gift, allowing them to see the world with new eyes. David couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. There was a time when he believed his wealth was the most important thing, that the money he had earned was what would sustain them through life's trials. But when Sarah got sick, none of that mattered. His millions couldn't save her, couldn't ease her suffering. In the end, it was their faith, their love for each other, and their trust in God that pulled them through. Now as he stood there watching her, he felt richer than he had ever felt in his life. The wealth they had lost seemed so insignificant compared to the love they had gained. They had been through the fire, and they had come out stronger on the other side. Sarah's recovery was nothing short of a miracle, and they both knew it. Every day she thanked God for the gift of life, for the healing that had defied all odds. They no longer took anything for granted. The simple act of sitting together in the evening, talking about their day, felt like the greatest blessing. They had learned to appreciate the little things, the moments that money could never buy. For David, the market and the pursuit of wealth had once been his entire world. But now, it was the quiet moments spent with Sarah that filled his heart with joy. Their story had taken them to the brink of despair, but it had also brought them to a place of deep peace and contentment. It wasn't just their love for each other that had grown stronger. Their faith had deepened in ways they never could have imagined. In the past, their relationship with God had been present but quiet, something that existed in the background of their lives. Now, it was at the forefront. Every morning, they prayed together, thanking God for the new day, for the love they shared, and for the miracle of Sarah's healing. They had learned through their suffering that true wealth wasn't found in money, cars, or houses. It was found in their connection with God and with each other. That connection had carried them through their darkest days, and now it was the foundation on which they were building their new life. David still worked, but not in the same way he had before. The pressure to maintain their wealth, to keep up with the fast pace of the market, no longer consumed him. He no longer cared about being the most successful, the richest, or the most powerful. His priorities had shifted entirely. Now, his work was about finding joy and meaning in what he did, about providing for the simple life they had built together. He didn't need the luxury cars or the grand house. He just needed Sarah and the quiet peace they had found together. And in that simplicity, he had discovered a kind of wealth he had never known before, one that was rooted in love, faith, and hope. Their story had come full circle, from the heights of material wealth to the depths of suffering, and now to a place of quiet, profound happiness. They had lost their fortune, but in the process, they had gained something far more valuable. The love between David and Sarah had grown deeper than either of them could have imagined, forged in the fires of adversity. Their faith, once quiet and unspoken, had become the guiding force in their lives, a beacon of hope that had carried them through the darkest of times. And now, as they stood on the other side of it all, they were closer to each other and to God than they had ever been. Their journey wasn't just a story of loss and recovery. It was a story of transformation, of finding true wealth in the things that mattered most. David often thought back to the life they had before. The wealth, the success, the material comforts that had once seemed so important. But now, looking at Sarah, seeing the joy in her eyes, he knew that they had gained something far more valuable than anything money could buy. They had gained perspective. They had learned that the real riches in life weren't found in the market, in the cars or houses or apartments. They were found in love, in faith, in the quiet moments shared with the people you cherish most. And that, David knew, was the greatest comeback of all. What would you do if you were in David's shoes? Could you handle the pressure of losing everything you've worked for, only to realize that none of it could save the person you love most? Do you think wealth can truly bring happiness? Or are the real treasures found in moments of faith, love, and connection? Share your thoughts. What do you think is more valuable, money or relationships? Have you ever experienced a time when faith carried you through a situation that seemed impossible? If this story made you think or touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss out on more stories that challenge, inspire, and connect us all.